Now you might be saying, what do you mean that the books aren't that important? They're packed with important information about the legacy era and the modern era of the FNaf Freddy's games. And I don't deny that. It isn't to say that the books aren't that important at all, but rather they aren't as important as we probably view them. These two book series, Fazbear, Frights and Tales of the Pizzaplex, are poor book series in terms of lore, and I'll explain why soon. But first, let's start at the very beginning, the Silver trilogy. Now these books, at the time, were set by Scott to expand on the mythos of the FNaf Freddy's universe, and it's something he said explicitly isn't in the continuity of the games. But the interesting thing Scott said about the first Silver book is that it wasn't intended to fit together with the games like a puzzle piece, and it's something you're kinda supposed to enjoy. But this is straight up contradicted in the first book with William Afton, the first time we ever saw the purple guy's name. We didn't exactly have confirmation that William Afton and the purple guy were in fact the same until Sis location, but then Mite Trap happened, and then FNaf 6 we got the definitive confirmation that it's the case. One thing FNaf 6 also does is retcon the kid outside into being Charlie Emily, another connection to the Silver trilogy, as well as her father, Henry, one of the owners of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, who was the cassette man in FNaf 6. We even got audio logs that read HRY, which we know is meant to be Henry using the Silver Eyes. The fourth closet, the final book in the series, reveals the amalgamation, a being composed from all 5 animatronic endos. According to the Ultimate Guide, it's meant to provide us with insight into the origin of Molten Freddy, implying that the missing children are actually in Molten Freddy, something that FFps already implies with the Sanity ending. Another thing that the Ultimate Guide says is that the books are meant to provide us with lore about the relationship between Henry and William, offering a possible reason for why he wanted to kill Charlie in the games. The Silver is extremely helpful and provides tons of lore about the characters that we otherwise wouldn't learn about, so I view this as something of importance, and it's definitely super important. Now let's move on to Fazbear Frights, or should I say Slotbear Frights. Scott made a Reddit post answering the question of whether the lore will ever be solvable. He said, over the next few years, there'll be lots of projects planned, and most are very story driven. Lots of the later stories will answer some of the biggest questions from the fan base over this past year, in my opinion. Very few people will likely ever feel completely satisfied, as there's too many headcanons out there and so many great ideas on where the story could go, but I think there are good things to be found for the people who are looking. All I can do is say that some questions will be answered, even if it may not be the answer that you wanted. Let me at least say this: future games will look forward, but look towards the novels to fill in some blanks to the past. Later, he clarified that he's referring to Fazbear Frights in the comments, so you might think with what Scott said, Fazbear Frights will fill in blanks for important stuff that we never knew about and give quote-unquote the biggest answers to the community. Yeah, no. Fazbear Frights at best gives a few answers about the game's lore, and even that's debatable. Into the Pit states to the MCI as in 1985, this is something supported by the Silver trilogy, and the other answers Frights have, like Andrew maybe being vengeful spirit, though I don't personally agree with that theory as I'm more of a golden toy chic man myself. Before Secrets of the Mimic, people said Fazbear Frights' purpose was to be in the game's continuity, and show us what happened to William after UCN, but now we know, with Secrets of the Mimic debunking tales, something connected to Fazbear Frights, that this isn't the case. So at best, Fazbear Frights solves a date with the MCI, covers some topics of Hudson, like him maybe being a fright guard in FNaf 3, exploring the concept of agony, and expanding more on the concept of embedded emotion, something for a show in a novel trilogy. Now, you might think that this seems like a decent amount of material to solve, and I'd 100% agree with you until you remember that Fazbear Frights has 37 stories, and this probably at best covers maybe 8 stories and a few epilogues. Most of these stories like Gundrop Angel, Pizza Kit, He Told Me Everything, and Kids at Play are useless and don't reveal anything about the games, and a book series that is set to give us lore about the games. You could argue that these stories may serve as parallels and stand-ins for characters in the games. An example of the parallel theory is the idea that Andrew is just a stand-in for Cassidy, with them both being Golden Freddy, Vengeful Spirit, with Andrew's defining feature being his curly black hair, and Cassidy means curly haired. Although I do find this kind of strange, he'd imply major story details to parallels, because parallels as a whole is kind of inconsistent. Let's use Henry and Edwin as an example. In the Mimic story, Edwin is shown pouring his rage into the Mimic, a parallel to Henry in the novels, was depicted doing the exact same thing. However, we know that Henry isn't Edwin as shown by Secrets of the Mimic. That would mean that Edwin isn't a stand-in for Henry, but rather he was only intended to share thematic parallels, not serve as an actual stand-in. What I see as a thematic parallel is the idea that these two characters can share similarities without them being the same person or meaning something towards another character, while a stand-in would mean that these connections, like Edwin pouring his rage into the Mimic, would mean something towards someone like Henry, like someone who thought he was the game's version of Edwin before Secrets of the Mimic. They're the same thing, but it's more so how it's used. It's kind of like how Goku's origin story shares thematic parallels with Superman, but doesn't mean that the creator Akira Toriyama had the intention of us reading Superman comics to learn anything new about Goku, while stand-ins are the idea that these details mean something towards the character they share thematic parallels with. This raises the question of how we distinguish between a stand-in and a thematic parallel. You can't exactly tell, so you have to pick and choose, and I feel like it's a major issue. So, Fazbear Frights barely has any stories, giving us insight to game stuff, and if those things do mean something, we don't exactly know what those things mean. Which I feel like beats the whole purpose of these stories, meaning to solve things if we can't exactly know what those things are. Fazbear Frights is 90% filler, and I'm very disappointed in what it did. Scott could have created many stories, such as a non-scrap story about Michael Afton, perhaps a story about the Afton family, or one that delves into Henry's trauma after the MCI. But no, we needed more Goosebump level stories. Now that I'm done trashing on Fazbear Frights, let's talk about its sequel series, Tales of the Pizzaplex. Now before Secrets of the Mimic, just like Fazbear Frights, we were given the impression that these books were actually in continuity with the games. For an example, GGY had direct connections to the games. One of the characters on the arcade, ABC, and Security Breach actually appears in the GGY story. So we thought, cool, this means that Tales is in the continuity of the games. After GGY, we assumed that all of the Mimic epilogues and the stories with Edwin filled in gaps meant for the games. We figured that the Mimic would eventually appear in the games, which he did with Ruin. So, most of us slotted Tales into the timeline of the games, along with the Mimic story. Although, Tales had some funky timeline issues, but most believers of Tales games just thought it was silly inconsistencies until the release of the one and only Secrets of the Mimic, being entirely different from the Mimic story. Edwin and Fiona met at school in Tales, but at Edwin's smartest company in the games.
Excuse me, can I borrow your voice for a project?
What for? I don't even know you. I'm brand new here. Let's start again. I'm Fiona, and you are?
Edwin Murray. This is my dad's place.
The house that they own in Tales is something they just bought, while in Secrets of the Mimic, it says it actually belonged to his father. And of course, the biggest one, Fiona actually lives past childbirth and dies in the fall of Fazbear instead. So now that Tales of the Pizzaplex isn't in the games, what does it even do? Now it isn't a required reading, so you can essentially just play the game. However, I feel that Tales not being canon is an issue because in the storyteller, when Edwin saw the Mimic infecting everything, he said it was happening again, implying something happened between the Mimic story and the storyteller, which we all thought was going to be Secrets of the Mimic, but that didn't happen, so I guess this is a plot line that now goes nowhere. And the crazy part that this could have actually worked with Secrets of the Mimic, since we do see the Mimic infecting everything like Big Top, Jackie, as well as a bunch of parts of machines in the fiery ending. And with like maybe a couple of changes to his story, it could have actually worked, but I guess it just didn't want Tales to be canon. And now that we no longer need Tales for the Mimic epilogues and the related stories, the only important stories are Help Wanted, GGY, and Phobia for the experiment rooms. And I guess if you really want to know about the daycare attendant, Somnophobia. Tales that be canon just makes most of these stories not really required, since the games have an entire revamped origin story of the Mimic, which is like 10 times better than the Mimic story. Plus, just like Fazbear Frights, it does have some bad stories, but at least Tales only 7 books, unlike Fazbear Frights 12 books. And that's basically my take. My main argument is that while some of the FNaf books provide important details about the game's lore, many don't offer much value for solving the game's continuity. The book's importance is often overrated, but what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments.